Would you pay $3,500 to be a guest on a really big podcast? My guest today did just that. I am chatting with Alex Sanfilippo, founder of PodPros, under which PodMatch exists, all about his $3,500 interview on Entrepreneurs on Fire. We're chatting through the application process, the interview, the explanation of what this fee is for, and the impact, all in the hopes that it helps you weigh the pros and cons of pay-to-play podcast interview opportunities. Let's do this. Hey there, pitches. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Go Pitch Yourself. I am your host, Angie Trueblood. And in this episode, we are pulling back the curtains on what paying for a podcast interview actually entails. I am so appreciative of our guest, Alex Sanfilippo's candidness and transparency throughout today's conversation. If you are new here, welcome. I am a podcast visibility strategist, founder of the Podwize group, and I have never paid for a podcast interview of my own. And I don't think I ever will, although I reserve the right to change my mind if the right opportunity comes along. If you're an OG listener, hello, my friend. Thank you for sticking with me. I hope you love this episode. It's part behind the scenes, part education, part entertainment, because I know this is a question, a conversation that has come up over the years in different groups and on different channels that I am involved with. So I am really pumped to bring it to you. But before we do that, we have our podcast love of the week, my friend. Now, this podcast love segment is a little bit different because I'm really doing it to celebrate someone who I adore. She is a listener of the podcast, and she and I have been friends for years. So Jennifer Mackey Mary hosts a podcast called the Everyday Style School, and she is looking at 1 million downloads right in the eyes. She's got her eye on 1 million downloads. And honestly, by the time this episode goes live, she may have already crossed that ridiculously impressive threshold. So I wanted to take a hot second to celebrate her, you, Jen, and let you know I am so freaking proud of all that you have done and all that you have poured into your show over the last almost 4 years. So if you have not listened to it, I highly recommend you go give it at least a listen. I think you'll find it's likely your cup of tea. It's a podcast that teaches you everything your mom never did about getting dressed. And she's really focused on inspiring listeners to love the way that we look every day by giving us the tools to make it easy. Jen is the guru of capsule wardrobes, and she actually releases capsules every single quarter to help you style yourself and get dressed for the season ahead in not really the most minimal way possible, but in the simplest way possible. So go give Jennifer's podcast a listen, Everyday Style School. Maybe we'll push her over the 1 million download mark if she has not already gotten there. But Jen, if you're listening, I love you, my friend. I am so proud of you, and your work in this space is such an inspiration. Okay, without further ado, let's dig into my conversation with Alex. So if you're unfamiliar with who he is, he's an entrepreneur and the CEO and founder of PodPros, which is a software company that's focused specifically on the podcasting industry, and PodMatch, which is a podcast guesting technology service, falls under that umbrella, which is what many of you may actually be familiar with. He hosts his own show called Podcasting Made Simple and is an educator in the podcasting space. He and I actually connected back in 2022 and have chatted several times about my coming on his show and also helping share PodMatch with my audience. But then I started this 3-part series on paid podcast interviews, and I knew I wanted to highlight someone who had paid a significant amount of money to guest on a show. So I knew Alex had guested on EOFire, And I also knew that EOFire charges $3,500 an interview. True to form, I asked him to come on the show, and he said yes. So enjoy my conversation with Alex Sanfilippo. Alex, I'm so excited to have you as a guest here on Go Pitch Yourself. Thank you for joining myself and our listeners today.
Angie, thank you so much for having me. And by the way, I love the title of your show. I know other people have said that before, but the very first time, I don't even know where I saw it initially, but feels like years ago at this point. I remember Sam being like, Go Pitch Yourself. I'm like, I love that. So anyway, as someone who's listened to your podcast and seen a lot of what you do, it's an honor to be here today. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I feel like this has been in the works. We've been in each other's orbit for a while now, and I'm so appreciative of you coming on today. We're going to have some candid conversations, and I really do want you also to share with our listeners about PodPros. We'll dig into the development and evolution of it in a bit, but I guess to level set, will you let listeners know who you are and what PodPros is generally?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Alex Sanfilippo, and my thing is 100% podcasting. So I haven't figured out a great way to articulate that yet, but that's all I do through and through. So if you ask me about other hobbies, other businesses, I don't have any of that. It's all podcasting. And so my company is called PodPros. And PodPros, we basically create software solutions along with a couple of their services as well to just serve independent podcasters and independent podcast guests. So we just do our best to find a way to again, help those people go further faster to get their voices heard and elevated through podcasting. That's what we stand for. That's what we love. And we'll probably dive into a little bit of the software stuff. And at the end of the day, everything we've done has just been as a direct response to what are you struggling with as a podcast guest or host? And when we hear those things, we find a way to offer some form of solution or point people to our friends that can. And that's been our whole initiative with PodPros.
I love that. How did you get into it? Was your background in podcasting before you started creating the software solutions?
No, my background wasn't in software and it wasn't in podcasting. I actually did 15 years in corporate. I worked in the aerospace industry. And Angie, I should give a disclaimer real quick because a lot of people hear that. They're like, ooh, sounds fun. I wasn't a skydiver, wasn't an astronaut, and I wasn't a fighter pilot. So I don't mean to burst everyone's bubble, but I worked behind a computer at a company that focused below the atmosphere. And we did parts support for a handful of different type of aircraft. So anyway, sounds kind of boring now, but I loved that job. However, at one point it actually went public. And when it went public, and this is maybe a mean way to say it, it was a multi-billion-dollar publicly traded company. Even though I was on the C-suite level, I felt like a cog in the system. Like I didn't feel like I had a lot of say or purpose in it anymore. And at that point, I decided I wanted to leave. And I don't know if it was brilliance or just ignorance, but I was like, I'm going to start a podcast to talk to people who have successfully left a 9-to-5 job to become a full-time entrepreneur. And I'm going to take people on that journey with me, but I'm going to learn it myself. And Angie, ultimately what happened is I learned like the most, if I can share it in the most simplified form, the 4 things it takes to be a successful entrepreneur. And so I'll share those as a bonus for everybody because it's not what we're getting into today.
You do not have to pay for this, listeners. This is free.
There you go. This is just at the rawest, simplest form. And I'm way underselling what I learned in a couple of years from people. But the whole concept of being an entrepreneur is to find an area of passion, to get into the community with other people who are passionate about that same thing, to find a simple solution to offer to a simple problem that they're focusing on, right? That they're struggling with. And for me, I started podcasting. I loved the industry. I decided I want to jump into it. So I got into the community. I started speaking at all the podcasting events. And then I just started asking, like purposefully, what are you struggling with in podcasting? And I'll never forget, at one point I validated that there was a problem and then I created a solution for it. So I didn't set out to become a full-time podcaster, but I set out to become a full-time entrepreneur, and podcasting just happened to be the lane. And since then, I've been in love with the industry and the space, and I meet really the most incredible people on earth. So that's I try to keep that as short as I can, but it's still a long story. Sorry, Angie, but that's kind of my whole process, if you will.
I mean, one, you're in very good company. I'm not sure. I know you have listened to the podcast. So I also have a very nerdy, and I can say that to you because it takes one to know one, background. So my background is ecological genetics and I did biology. And so I totally understand. And it's interesting too that we have such a passion for podcasting. I don't know if it's because there is this like tech nerdy component to it, but then it's also this people forward that we're probably didn't have a lot of in some of our former life. So it's really interesting to hear some of the parallels. Is the original podcast, do you still do it? Or what was the name of it? Is it still out there if we want to?
It was called, it's the content is still around. I'll explain. Okay. So it was called Creating a Brand. And it was
Okay.
about the art of creating a brand. Like, how do you build a brand for yourself? And those were kind of the focuses of the show. And I really enjoyed it. And the feed is still there, but it's now called Podcasting Made Simple, which is my show. So Podcasting Made Simple started at episode 159, but 1 through 158 will still say creating a brand when you go listen to it. And some stuff has been tweaked in it, so it stays relevant, right? But in general, you'll find the content that was there. And I still love that content. Like, it was hard, Angie, for me to stop that show. But I just, again, knowing the importance of staying focused on the people that you're serving at that point, I knew I had to make that shift. As difficult as it was, I did it. But the content still exists. The show title doesn't exist anymore.
Okay, cool. All right. So we're going to dig into all of that. My initial outreach to you was coming on the heels of a series that we've been running on paying for podcast interviews, because as a podcast pitching and guesting agency, we have seen, I won't say it's a huge trend at the moment, but we have seen an uptick in podcast hosts asking for payment in exchange for interviews. And so we've talked about kind of some of the ethical and business implications of when that might make sense. We've had Gordon Firemark on to talk about legal implications and what you need to disclose. I wanted to talk with someone who had paid typically a significant amount of money to be a guest on someone's show. And I saw that you had been a guest on Entrepreneurs on Fire with John Lee Dumas. And I said, hey, would you be up for coming on and just talking about that experience? And you were so gracious in saying yes to do that. So I'd really like to just kind of dig into, one, how that opportunity became available. Like, did you go through the standard guest application? I would love to know kind of the behind the scenes process of even navigating getting accepted to be on the show. Yeah,
sure. So, first off, I love that we're talking about this topic. I think it's an important one right now, and I hope we really, really get into it. Hopefully today, because I have thoughts that are unfiltered right now. So everyone here today will get to hear some fun stuff, hopefully. But that process for me, to date, that was the only podcast I've ever paid to be on. I really wanted the experience, one, of being on Entrepreneurs on Fire. I mean, let's face it, it's a huge show. John has done an incredible job. So is Kate, making that whole engine run.
For sure.
And they're people that I really respect in podcasting. And at the same time, I was also like, I've never paid to be on a show. I actually wonder what that is like. I just want to know. And I did go through the entire process just like anyone else would. I filled out the application. I did all the things, right? And I don't know the exact number, but I think they get around 400 pitches a month or something like that. Something crazy. And they accept 8 or something. And thankfully mine was one of them that got accepted. And I did a good job on the pitch. I'll say that. Like, I didn't, and you all have talked about that a lot. Actually, you had a really good, I'm already calling back a previous episode of your show as someone who likes it. It was episode 78 with Crystal Profit, maybe is it? Yeah. And she talked about, like, the second half of the interview, you were talking about, like, just how to make that happen, right? And she kind of just shared, like, how to actually share the content, how to get on it. It was a really interesting episode. So I encourage everyone, go back and listen to 78. That was a good, Go Pitch Yourself. It was a good episode. But anyway, I digress. And you have many other pieces of content around that. But I wanted the experience. So that's kind of, I did the whole normal outreach. I know John and Kate, but not well enough to be like, hey, let me on your show. And
slide
by the way, they have
DMs.
zero. Yeah, they don't have any, there's no exceptions. If John's mom wants to come on the show, she's paying $3,500. That is just how it works.
Okay, that's good to know, because that's a question I've had too. Like, would he outreach to people? Like, I don't even know if he still does that. Like, does he invite guests on, or do they just pull, like, from that pool of 400?
If he does invite you on, you're still paying, no matter what. That is a non-negotiable. That is the cost to be on the show. And again, zero. They at least they claim, and I trust them, zero exceptions to that rule.
Yeah, I appreciate knowing that a lot.
Yeah.
So then they reached out to you and they said, your application has been accepted. We're going to go ahead and get this booked and recorded. Was there any interaction with the team beforehand? I'm always interested in how people prep for podcast interviews, both as the guest and as the host. So did they let you know kind of the direction of the show?
So because they have there's a good vetting team there. I don't know if it's John, if it's Kate, who it is exactly, but they've done a really good job making sure they're only picking people that are going to be really high quality. And so the first thing you have to do after you're accepted, and they give you like a timeline to do this in, is you need to submit the questions that you want John to ask you, along with a small snippet of how you plan on answering it, just to give them that whole thing. So actually, again, they are systems experts. Not that John doesn't do a good job interviewing, because he's a brilliant interviewer, but I'm the one who made the questions that he asked, and he asked the questions nearly word for word. Now, he might not do that with everybody, but I had a direction for it. And I will say this, I went back and listened to the episode I did, which I encourage, if you're a guest, go back and listen to your episodes. And I remember telling Alicia, my wife, I said, and I don't usually use this word, I'm like, I did perfect. Like I don't feel that I made I don't think I could do that better if I tried it a million more times. Like I think I actually did perfect. And I'm not a perfectionist. I just listened to him like that was literally a flawless interview. And so maybe he would tweak the questions if I didn't ask them as well. But word for word, what you hear on their show as a listener is exactly how the recording goes. I don't think he edited a single thing out at all. Like it flows exactly the same.
I love knowing that, because it's like that part of me. Now I want to go back and listen to a couple. I mean, you're very well schooled in podcast guesting and podcast interviews and the strategy of how to get messages across as a guest. But I'm thinking there's probably a good number of people from different industries who might not have the wherewithal to really set up the questions in the best way. And I do wonder, and we'll talk about impact, but I wonder if they're able to set their interviews up in a way, and do they just kind of follow along the questions that were given? Because, if you're investing $3,500, I like that you have a little bit of skin in the game to guide the direction of the conversation.
Yeah, me too. I at first I didn't know what to expect, and my first thought when I got accepted, before I read the rest of the email, which I should have just read first, was, man, I hope he's going to want to talk about the right stuff. But then he's like, tell me what the right stuff is. I'm like, perfect, there we go. So I again appreciate that, but I did have the same thought and question, like, what if I had the budget, have a good topic, but don't really know how to share it? And maybe they just don't accept those people, because when I listen to the show, I feel that everyone's very well versed. And I think he does a great job. Even people I've heard on other shows, he does a good job getting the right information. So maybe either he's tweaking it and doing some training, or he's only picking people that are going to do a stand-up great job. But the show is incredible. If you want 20 minutes of the best information of what that person has, it's a great way to find it.
Yeah. How did it feel being interviewed since you had prepped the questions? Did it feel conversational? Did you feel a lot of what I love about podcast guesting, especially as a business owner looking to grow your network, is that relationship with the host? Did you feel like there was that connection? And is that something y'all have kept in touch with after? Or is it more just like, no, this is really an opportunity to get in front of a really large audience?
It's the opportunity. It's a transaction. And I don't, John is actually John and I will sometimes just get on calls just to talk. And they're longer than that interview sometimes. He's a great guy. He knows that Entrepreneurs on Fire is his business, and he treats it like a transaction, because that's exactly what it is. You're not on video together or anything. He jumps straight in. He's like, hey, how are you, man? I'm like, good. He's like, cool. Let's jump in. You ready? Question 1. And just goes straight into it. And it's just like, you're in and out in 25 minutes, maybe. So there's no room for anything at the end. He's not like, cool, that was great. He's like, all right, thank you. We'll let you know when it's out. And then just hangs up and he's on to the next one. Because from what I know, I don't know if the exact number. I think he does 8 a month, but he'll do all 8 back to back. He'll get them all done in one sitting. And apparently the team edits and does everything that same day. Like I don't know if they get 100% of it done, but somehow they figure out how to do the whole thing at one single point. So when he says I only work a couple days a month, he's serious. And I can tell you that's how it felt. So my responses were very organic, because I did not script it. And I think that some people might, but I knew what I wanted to say, but you never know quite how you will say it. And letting that organicness, for lack of a better term, that's not a real word. Sorry, everybody.
Authenticity?
There you go. Authenticity. That's it. Organicness is a new word, though. I like it. I'm going to get a shirt that says that.
Yeah.
Anyway, but letting that come out, it really worked well for me, and keeping it the time that he wanted it. It's just one of those things that, like, if you're tactful, and I kept a clock next to me, like I was ready to go. So it was a good experience. Definitely a transaction. Definitely the whole thing was like high pressure as well, because I'm usually nervous, but he's like, hey, you got to have this thing tight. Like, it's not going to be a minute over 20 minutes or something like that. So, but yeah, I had a blast. I was probably sweating a little bit, which is not like me, but it was cool. So,
okay, a couple more questions. Oh, and as an aside, I went to his talk at Podcast Movement 2019. And he said and I don't know if he still keeps up this cadence, but he guests on 20 podcasts a month, or he at least did as he was growing the show. And I think he did those also in one day.
Yeah, he still does that.
Yeah.
still does it. And so he'll give you, for most people, you're going to get 15 minutes is what he'll give you. And so he always like the email will say, record your intro and outro later. Like, let's maximize the 15 minutes we get. But he will literally not leave a minute between them. So the next one he's done and his team has it where it'll just roll into the next one automatically. And so, yeah, he can, I don't know how many he does in a day, but he showed me his, I don't know when it was, but he sent me a picture of his calendar for a certain day. And it made me so, I don't even know how to describe how I felt. I'm like, I don't know if I'm tired or overwhelmed or stressed, but like, that's just today. But he knocks it out. And then, like you said, he's done. He's working just a couple days a month or a few days a month. And I think it's the brilliance of somebody who's willing to do what some of us just haven't been willing to do. And because of that, he's been able to really make a name for himself in podcasting.
For sure. For sure. So how long from the time-ish that it was accepted to recorded to released? Any remembrance? That's also not a word, I don't think, of that.
I'm going to put organic remembrance on a shirt. I think those two words together will make a lot of sense to people, at least in this episode. It's an inside
Both
thing,
our
right?
logos.
Go pitch yourself, audience. That's what you need. We're going to get you that shirt made. Don't worry about it. Anyway, it was about 2 months, maybe 2.5 months, somewhere between that range is what it was. It wasn't long. It wasn't like 6 months out or anything.
All right, cool. Did they give you an opportunity did you have like a call to action? Were they like, hey, Alex, so great to have you on the show. Where can people reach you if they're looking to connect with you after this?
Yes. And that was one of the primary questions of like, it literally like said under the question, hey, this is your chance to tell people where to find you. It made it very clear. And he wanted to be very pointed and short because, again, them being experts, they know what converts. So they're basically saying, don't ramble about it. Get straight to the point of what you want from somebody and make that very precise and clear. They mapped that out and they gave me that chance. And that was one of the things that I felt that actually John did really well because he went off the cuff at that point and said, hey, I can speak to this Alex guy. Like I know him personally, and added like the reinforcement of the fact that he definitely believes in what I do. And I respected that a lot. So yeah, they give you that chance. And he set it up in a way that felt very organic and natural to conversation, not like, and Alex has a special offer for you, right? It wasn't that. So yeah, it ended up working out really well.
Okay. And last question about kind of what they did. When the episode went live, what kind of promotion did they do? Or I'm almost guessing they do very little promotion. I don't know.
The only place they reference them is on, I think maybe it's John's Instagram, but just on his story. And it's just like a sound bite from it. And I think they do that with every episode, but that's the only promotion it had on their end. Granted, I don't know is that they need it. They have such a loyal audience. And I don't know is that a lot of them are really following them on social media because they don't have a huge social strategy because they just know who their audience is and where they can actually be found. So yeah, there was on there and there was very little. I think they maybe even reposted what I shared on a couple of the platforms, but that was past that was it.
I think that's almost the beautiful thing of a show like that is it shows us. Now, granted, it has been in existence for years and it's huge, but I think a lot of times we place so much emphasis on sharing our podcast on social and really just nailing it, in all of these different places. And a lot of times if you have an engaged listenership, they will share it. If you ask them to help you share it, that works. So I think I sometimes will post new episodes on Instagram. I always post on LinkedIn, but that's part of my LinkedIn strategy. And so it almost gives me hope that the days of being able to grow a podcast with actual podcast listeners is not gone yet.
Yeah, I actually think it's doing better than it has in the past. Here's an example of that. And I know we're going off on a tangent here, so I'll make this really brief. At one point, my show went kind of flatlined with the amount of listenership growth. Like there's people listening and stuff, but it just wasn't growing. Yeah. And then I just randomly in an episode put like a little mid-roll thing in, if you will, like so what felt like an ad, but it wasn't an ad. And I simply said, hey, if you're enjoying this show, can you think of one person that would add value to it and share it with them and tell them why you shared it? And overnight, my show grew by 20%. And it was already like, wasn't the biggest show in the planet, but it was big enough that 20% is a very substantial amount. Like we're talking like thousands of people type of thing, right?
Yeah.
So, and it was simply because I made an ask. And if you think about it, like so many hosts are like, Alex, can you share this on Instagram when it goes out? I'm like, sure, I can. I'm like, but when most people are on Instagram, they're laying down their bed and they're not going to they're not going to click over to listen to a podcast. That's not what they're looking for.
My husband's like in bed next to me asleep. I'm not going to play a podcast.
Exactly. Yeah. Anyway, I digress. I know that's not the point. I'm sorry I went off on that tangent there.
Well, I mean, no, we can stick with it for a hot second because one thing we've done for my guest episodes, I don't share them on Instagram because it's kind of gone dark over there for us. But I always do a promo spot in the beginning of my episodes. And it's a segment we call Podcast Love of the Week. And I highlight the people that have invited me onto their show. I tell them why that interview has something that my audience hasn't heard from me before. So it really does kind of push them over to listen. And they're podcast listeners. They're not Instagram scrollers when they hear that.
It's very smart. I like that a lot. I've never heard anyone do that. That's a very good idea.
Did they reach back out to you? Did they let you know it was going to go live? And did they give you any assets to share? Because we see a lot of podcast hosts. One end of the spectrum is they never let us know when an interview goes live. So it's hard to share. But Courtney in-house, she actually scrubs Apple Podcasts once a week to see if any of our clients' recorded shows have gone live. But then on the other end, we'll sometimes see hosts creating tons of assets that we just candidly don't share. Like we'll share to our client will share to the platform where they're active on. And so sometimes I wonder, are hosts just spending too much time making assets that never actually get shared? So I would love to know what that process was.
To my remembrance, I don't think they gave me any assets.
Yeah.
They gave me a link to the page and a link to the episode. It was obviously an automated email. I don't even know which address it came from, but it wasn't like a personalized thing, and that's fine. I ended up making my own graphic, and I think if I can just get inside the mind of John and Kate real quick, early on, they probably did all that, but they have so much clout now that any of us are going to find a unique way to share it because we're very proud of it. So if you look through any of my social media, you'll find where I'm holding a phone with that episode up on it, and it got really good engagement. That's really better than any asset they could have given me. And I think that they've actually learned to just bank on that happening, which is a really smart move at their level. Now, if you're a brand new podcaster, I don't suggest that you bank on that happening, right? But with that name, when I posted it, my entire network knows exactly who that is and what show that was. And so it worked out well for me. But my team built the asset internally. Like we didn't have anything from them.
Okay, so let's talk about, well, he does like the intro and outro later. So it was really just getting the audio from you. When the interview went live, do you know, and I listened to an episode of his a while back, and I don't think they were disclosing that the guests were sponsored guests, but do they do any sort of disclosure on the episode that the interview spot is a paid opportunity?
No, I haven't listened this week, so I could be wrong, right? And if someone's listening to this in the future of our recording date, maybe they end up doing that. But at that time of recording, from when I listened just a couple weeks ago, that's not in there.
Okay. So that's like my biggest challenge with this approach is the listeners. I mean, you and I know, I've known that he's charged for years and other people in the podcasting space have known too. But I feel like, and I'd love to get your thoughts on it, I feel like the listeners kind of deserve to know that this is a paid opportunity or even like a transaction, like you mentioned. What are your thoughts on that being in the podcasting space?
Yeah, and this was another reason I wanted to have the experience. Obviously, I got an ideal experience in this case, right? Like, because there's a lot of people that are in podcasting like, hey, it's $300 doing my show, and fine, right? But I was like, hey, if I can test this on like a really big show, that's great. The way that John and Kate position it, which I really liked, is it's basically your fee for being associated with the brand, not for being on the podcast. And so they position it differently than most. So most people say, hey, there's a fee for being on the show. Theirs is more so it's an association with our brand, and it's going to pay for like the assets and stuff like that that we're doing a full production for it, right? So it's more on that side of things. It's more or less the same thing, but they position it a little bit different, right? And I respected the fact that they made it clear it's not just so you can be on the podcast. You're on the podcast because you have a story that we believe will impact our listenership. And they did a good job of separating those things. So for them, I almost give them a pass on it because of the way they position it, of the value it adds. Now, I've never seen that happen anywhere else. Everyone else is like, it's $300 doing my show because I can charge you, right? Like, so I've seen the opposite happen. But again, the way they teed it up was really great. At the same time, if you go to traditional media, it is technically an advertisement. If someone's paying for it in any way, it's an advertisement for that. And that's why when you watch TV, an infomercial, it says at the beginning, this is a paid ad. We're not associated with it. They paid us for this spot, right? Like making it very clear. I don't know if they had that disclaimer somewhere on their website or if because of the way they position it, if the lawyer said, if a lawyer told them at one point, you're good. But again, I tend to want to give, not to want to, I do give them a pass on it because of the way they tee it up and position it.
So, but that's how they, and this is me, like, I feel comfortable with you, but that's how they positioned it to you, right? Mm-hmm. Like on a contract or something. Mm-hmm. So to me, then that's not like how it's being positioned to the listener, just as like the devil's advocate.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Because I have shared before, like within some of our private communities, and people had no idea. Like people have really deep-seated thoughts on this. I have deep-seated thoughts, but I also am like, okay, we all have a choice. Like we can choose to pay for interviews and we can choose to decide if we want to be on a show that doesn't necessarily disclose that financial relationship to the listener, or we can not, you know. There's been one instance where we had someone who was going to charge our client and it was a nominal fee. So I was like, well, let's just do it like you, like, let's just test it and see. So we send back whenever a host says, you know, it's going to be $125 or it's going to be $300. And we send back an email that's like, okay, can you share your stats? Because this is advertising now. And we ask a couple of standard questions. And one of them is, how do you let your listeners know about this, you know, financial relationship? Most of them say they don't. But the one that we tested, I said yes to because she positions the client as like the sponsor of that week's episode, which I appreciate.
You know, I have thoughts on this whole topic as well. Like, let's even taking Entrepreneurs on Fire out and this client that you just talked about, or the podcast they were on. In general, I don't really like the idea of it because if I'm a great guest, like I could be a great guest on your show, like go pitch yourself. Let's imagine you have a $1,000 guest appearance fee, right?
I do. It's just post interview. You're going to get the invoice after.
Oh, right. That's way smarter, by the way.
If you want this to go live.
That's awful. Anyone listening who's thinking about doing that, do not. That was a joke. That's so funny. Anyway, like if I'm the good guest, I don't have the budget for it. And then you say yes to somebody else who can talk about a similar topic where they're not really the best guest. They just have the budget for it. Now you just kill the quality of your content, right? Like now your content is suffering so that you get $1,000. And my thing is my experience with podcasting when it comes to being a host or a guest for that matter on either side of the mic is it's a relationship. It is the start of a relationship. But if you turn it into a transaction by putting a dollar amount, you just killed that connection. Now no longer is Alex coming to Angie's show so we can build this meaningful experience together. No, you're telling me, hey, this is a transaction with you. Give me your money. We'll do it. And then you're done. Right?
Yeah. And
again, when you look at something like Entrepreneurs on Fire, that is the expectation. As maybe the listeners don't know that, but me as a guest, I know that that's the point of it. And that was okay with me. Right. But in general, I think that many of us, we're shooting ourselves in the foot, especially the podcast hosts are like, hey, $50 to be on the show. I'm like, you could probably make $5,000 off me in the next year if we just continue to build this relationship, but you're going to turn into a $50 immediate, like, give me this and then let's never talk again. I have a lot of thoughts on this and I'm just sharing just the tip of the iceberg with you. And I said I'd be pretty raw. So here we are.
Let's wrap up the Entrepreneurs on Fire.
Sure.
I would like to know the impact. So one of your signature softwares is Podmatch, and it's software as a service, right? So
correct.
I guess share with our listeners a little bit. That's what you pitched, I'm assuming, at the end of the interview.
Yes. Yep, it is. Okay. And for anyone listening who doesn't know what that is, Podmatch is a software that automatically connects guests and hosts together for interviews. Literally works just like a dating app, but instead of connecting you for dates, it connects you for podcast interviews. So super fun. Anyway, that's what I talked about. I talked about being a podcast guest and for lack of a better term, pitching yourself, right?
Yeah.
So it was just explaining kind of my process for doing that and then saying, hey, and if you do want to find the podcast to pitch, use Podmatch. And I used a unique code so I could track who was coming back from the episode. I will say, I went on that interview expecting nothing just because that's kind of the way I roll, but I would then be allowed to use their logo on the website because again, that's the contract we enter into. And having that logo on my website has done very well for us. So I can't even tell you what that ROI is because people see it and automatically associate me with, oh, wow, that's a really good show. That's huge. Yeah, I want to be part of this. So that alone makes it worth it in my mind. When I track the actual ROI, I would say it's pretty good, slightly below expectation. Which was interesting, and maybe I was
none.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry. When I do I had no expectations. It was below that. No, there was conversion, and I would say it broke even for us within 3 months, probably. And our software is not expensive or anything like that. So like that, again, I was happy with that because we got our investment back. But most importantly was being able to use the logo in the way that we did and have the backlink from their website as well. And still to this day, I send that episode out to people on a regular basis. And that again, has worked very well for us. But the actual ROI that came directly from it made me question if I was the right guest. Now, I think the topic was valuable, but I did think in my head, I'm like, oh, we really only need this many people. That's probably going to happen the first day. And no, it happened over a month. So that was a little interesting to me. So, but it's proof of and all due respect to them, but it's proof of what has been said about the really big podcast. There's the old saying that people might come to a podcast for the guest, but they stay for the host. And when a host hits a celebrity status, it's getting millions of listens. The listeners no longer really care about the guest. They're going to listen to every single episode because they have truly fallen in love with the host. They might not even hear a guest call to action anymore because they're just like, give me more of John, right? Again, speaks to his level of expertise and just his amazingness all around, right? But that has been said about many of these big shows that you don't get near the ROI because people, once again, they are only there now because of the host. The guest is just an afterthought. And so just when it comes to ROI, think about that. I've been on 5 shows with more than 1 million people who listen to them every month, and none of them have been my top converting ROI. I've been on shows with under 100 listeners total, and some of those have done better than these 1 million plus shows. Because again, people are there, but they're very curious about what they can learn from the show versus, oh my gosh, I love this host, right? Yeah. So for what it's worth, that's what I got from it, and those are my actual thoughts on the topic.
No, I so appreciate you being candid about it. We've seen that too on our end because I have clients who have been on Entrepreneurs on Fire years ago, but still when it was very big, and then some other bigger shows. And we always find that our sweet spot is more of a niched vertical. Like if the show is very specific, talking to a very specific audience, it's typically more highly engaged than general shows. And I think with shows like John's that he's covering so many different topics. Like, yes, it's all under the umbrella of business, but not every guest topic is relevant to every listener. So it's like you're almost trying to catch, the fish in this really big sea and hope that the people that are listening are interested in podcast guesting, when your interview comes out. So I think it's the celebrity status, but also that some of the bigger shows are more general in the topics that they cover. So the audience isn't going to be as engaged with every guest.
Yeah. The riches are in the niches, right? Now, how it's said, it's, you will see those results in podcasting. And and you actually do a really good job, Angie, preaching the same thing I'm about to share, which is you don't just try to go after all the biggest shows. And every day I have a guest come and be like, how do I get on the top 10 biggest shows in the world? I'm like, you don't want to. And they're like, no, trust me, Alex. I know this space. I want to. I'm like, I promise you don't, because I've been on some of them and I'm telling you, you're not going to get anything out of it. And they're like, well, you must not be good at what you do. I'm like, all right.
I'm pretty good.
So I'm like, go ahead and spend the next 5 years and try to get on one of those shows or go on 10 shows that are specifically in your niche. And I promise you'll get more results. And I can't tell you how many times I have people come back and be like, oh my gosh, this doesn't make any sense, but you're right. And how are you right? And it's what you're just now saying. It's when it's specifically in a niche, the listeners are listening for that specific topic and they are more primed and ready than anybody else to take action. So you and I feel the same way about that. I know we don't need to we're preaching to the converted already, right? We don't need to keep on doing that. But I think for anyone listening, that's an important element. For me, I seek the smaller shows at this point that have a true focus, that is one that I can help impact and influence the listener. And nothing is better than that in my book anymore.
Well, and candidly, that's why my show is such a perfect fit for what you offer and what you do. It's a no-brainer.
Oh, yeah.
So tell me then, I would love to dig into Podmatch, and we can talk about the bigger PodPros umbrella if you would like, because you've also got something for podcast hosts, right? It's kind of like the processes, SOPs for hosting.
Sure. First off, the parent organization, if you will, we have the name PodPros. And I did that out of, maybe it was laziness. I don't know what to call it. But we first had Podmatch, and then we added a second service. And then my social team's like, great, we need social media accounts for all these as well, and a blog. And what do we do with separating the podcast? I said, absolutely not. I said, we are going to make a parent organization, and that will be the blog, that will be the social media, that will be the podcast, the educational wing, and then our softwares will fall under that. And anyway, we did that, and we're all super happy people. So, because no one wants 3 or 4 Instagram accounts, right? Like, dear God, please, no.
No.
So that's kind of where PodPros came from. So it's our educational wing. And under that, we have 3 software services. Podmatch being the first. The next one was Podcast SOP, which stands for Standard Operating Procedures. It's project management software that helps podcast hosts with their production of releasing episodes on time through a checklist that they build, and they can just press a button that'll repeat it, and it's got all kinds of great stuff in it. And the latest one and our last one, I think this is going to be it, is called Pod Lottery. And it's a fun way to do review swaps in a lottery format for podcast hosts specifically. So you'd register, you put in your podcast, and then you'd automatically get a ticket. With that ticket, you redeem it for a number, and every night numbers are drawn. If yours picked, other members will leave you reviews based off how many you win. And when they leave you a review, they win a ticket and another chance to win. And it's kind of like, again, a glorified review swap in a really fun gamified way. And that one's really early on, but we've had people win like up to 162 reviews. I think was someone won that the other day, which I'm like, no way. How cool is that? Like a show that had 5 reviews now has 100 and some odd. And it's been really cool. We really enjoyed that. And that one's just totally for fun. It'll never be monetized or anything. It's just like, let's build community among podcasters. And anyway, that's our software suite, if you will.
Okay. It's so fun. I want to talk about Podmatch. We did a review probably a year ago with one of our previous colleagues. We reviewed a couple of the podcast host, podcast guest matching services, and Podmatch above any is one where, because we have joined as an agency before, we've been looking for some solutions for us because we have an internal database of over, I think we're at like 1,200 now. But even then, there's new shows coming out all the time. If they're niched and engaged, I would like to add them. And so I joined Podmatch as an agency for a bit. And I will say it is such an easy to use platform. And you've got a lot of people on there. I think, and this is me being candid, and you can tell me whatever you want to tell me. We'll edit as needed. But I think as someone, so people that come to us and they either want to do a big strategy package with us or they want us to take over their pitching, if they have never guested before and they have never like figured out if podcast guesting is something that can actually give them an ROI, I want them to go off and do it on their own before they really start to invest in it. And even then, there's this level of entrepreneur in terms of how much they're looking to invest in guesting. And Podmatch is such a good fit, I feel, to get in there, to get to know other people in your space, to not spend all of your time searching in Apple Podcasts if you don't have a system, if you don't have training on how to quickly know if this is a show that would even make sense. So I feel like the technology of it is spot on with being able to connect people. How has it's grown significantly? Because you launched it a couple years ago. I feel like it's been out for a little bit.
First off, thank you for all the kind words. Thank you. Yeah. That's amazing here. Yeah. June 15th, 2020 was our official launch date that we had. Yeah. So it's at time of recording, it's been a few years. Yes.
Okay. How many hosts and how many guests do you have on it?
I really should have looked that up right beforehand. I really should have looked. I'm not entirely certain. I know it hangs around the same level. I think at time recording, it's in, this isn't an exact number, but I think it's around 6,000 of each is where we're at. And it's probably a little bit over that. Funny enough, on the homepage of it, I do post the total member number. So if we like went over there, we could see it along with how many interviews have happened in the last 24 hours and all that. It's easy for me to go look at. Let's put it that way. So I don't have to log into a dashboard. So,
well, and I see it grow and expand over the last couple of years with adding different features to it. So I highly recommend, especially for listeners that are just getting started pitching themselves, and also for people who are looking to kind of explore different niches, like the search features in there are really nice. And if you're a paid member, you have access to be able to contact the host. I felt like when I used it, it was a bit more skewed towards people wanting to be a guest, which totally makes sense. Like, I feel like that's the harder of the two, right? Is that what you're seeing on your end? People are using it more for?
It was, and now we've really, again, leveled out. And we've worked hard to make sure that we try to keep it that level because we kind of figured out like the optimal health level, which we didn't know when we launched, but we've done that. And I should mention this right now at time recording, again, around 6,000 of each people. In total, we've had 40,000 people come through it. one thing that makes us different than most software companies, if there's a software founder hearing this, they probably are going to want to like throw a rock at me because people in software hate this. But if someone's inactive and we reach out to them and they're not planning on coming back, we remove them from the system. We don't even let them pay anymore. They're gone on both sides. If your podcast is no longer active and you're done with it, we remove you automatically. And we just kind of built that in, and we have ways of being able to tell when people hit that point. Because what I don't want to have happen is you join as a guest or a host and reach out to 10 people and none of them get back to you. And one of the complaints in this industry, because podcasting on the hosting side has an 85% plus churn rate, meaning people don't continue their shows, most people reach out, their complaint is no host ever gets back to me. I'm like, well, it's probably because the host has quit, right?
Yeah.
And what we don't want on our software is people reaching out on either side of the mic to nothing, right? So we keep it we keep a clean database, which again, from a software perspective, is a total no-no. It's all about big numbers, doesn't matter the quality. It's just the bigger the number is, the better your software is. And we subscribe to the opposite of that, and it has served us extremely well. And so we've added features based off what our members today are looking for. The people who are trusting us to serve them today, what they're looking for is what we're adding. And that's been a big focus of ours.
So recently we ran across a host and she accepted. She said our client was great, but that she was only booking interviews through Podmatch, which got me digging into what that was all about. And I learned that you created a monetization opportunity for podcast hosts, which I love, because a lot of this pay to play for interviews, I think, comes from a space of creators wanting to get paid for the time they're putting into creating, right? And that can be a challenge, but you're doing it through technology. So why did you do that? And what is it exactly?
Yeah, thank you for asking this. I never get asked this question. It was something I was really excited to do. Yeah, it's. I feel like it was pretty cool. But anyway, what we decided to do is we realized the same thing that you realized. A lot of hosts started charging, not because they necessarily wanted to charge, but they're like, hey, listen, my husband or wife or my family, it's just like I'm spending $80 a month, and that adds up over time, and they don't really like that, right? So in my mind, I'm like, how can we help them offset that? Like, I'll give you a disclaimer right now for anyone listening. You're not going to get rich using Podmatch. And I'm sorry to say that, but it's just not.
Even if you have a daily show.
Even if you have a daily show. And we do the daily show people. I asked Alicia my wife, just the other day, they can make, right now we see between $500 and $600 a month is what they make. I'm super happy with that. Again, you're not getting rich from it, but that should offset with a daily show of all of your production costs, but some of it, right? It'll help out. Anyway, I digress to that point. But the point being, we decided to do a profit share with podcast hosts. So what a lot of people initially thought, like, oh, you're paying me for guest. I'm like, no, like we just talked about, I'm like, no, I'm not paying you for guest. I'm paying you based off of how many people are using Podmatch, based how often you're doing interviews, like full transparency. We just cut our profit directly in half, and 50% of it goes back to creators that are using our software based off of how many times they're using it. So if you use it once a month, you're getting paid for once a month, right? If you're using it 30 times a month, you're getting paid for that. And the whole thing is done with an algorithm all in the background. Nothing about it is manual at all. But the idea was, can we help hosts offset their production cost and maybe even make a few dollars? Yeah. And as our revenue climbs, we're going to see more and more go back into the pockets of creators. And again, a total software no-no. A software founder, again, wants to throw another rock at me because, like, don't give your money away. I find that if I take care of the people that are helping make the world a better place through their podcast, that comes back to me, right? Whether it's monetarily or at least from the perspective of I get to feel good for helping make the world a better place. And that's what I get more excited about. But yeah, that's exactly what we built out. And it's been really received well by people. They've really, really enjoyed it a lot. And I think it's just our way of helping giving back a little bit.
Well, and they get paid when the episode releases, right? So it's not just, oh, I booked this guest. They have to... I don't know. I don't know the logistics of going in and like proving it, but
there's that saying that the few ruin it for the many, right? Like there's the bad group. Yeah. So at first we had people that immediately realized, if I said I just interviewed these 50 people and I'm getting paid for those 50 people, and we went in, we're like, and all the people that they were interviewing, quote unquote, are saying, I don't know who this person is, but they just pressed this button and now apparently I have been interviewed by them. So we did have to change it. It's tracked to, yes, is this podcast episode being released, right? Because if you there's a difference between you tell me you recorded with 50 people and you release 50 episodes. I guess someone could still just go release 50 episodes, but that's a lot of work at that point.
I mean, you could just take raw audio and there's much better ways to make money.
I think there's much better. I'll just give you the money for that creative. Just hit me up after this interview and let me know if you really need money that bad, just let me know.
That's awesome. Yeah, I love what you were doing with Podmatch. And I'm an affiliate of it. And you and I worked out the ability for my listeners to have a discount. So they will get 10% off of the typical subscription fee. So listener, you can go over to joinpodmatch.com/Podwize and be able to sign up. You get your discount and then you can really check it out. So if you're a podcast guest who is looking to connect with more hosts, if you're a host who's looking to connect with more guests, or if you're both, definitely hop over and check it out. I have really enjoyed it. And again, I think it's a great place for people to kind of get their feet wet and then also go in for specific purposes. So definitely check out what Alex has done. I love it. I know we've kind of touched on this in the beginning, but I always like to ask our guests, what impact has podcast guesting had on your business?
I think it's been the primary driver of my business, believe it or not. So one thing that's interesting about us is we haven't done a single paid ad ever for anything. We've had no like grand scheme marketing campaigns. I don't even send emails enough. And I know I'm working on that for anyone who's like, you need to send emails. I'm working on it. I'm just now getting started with that. But I've grown, we've been able to grow the business strictly by me going on shows and showing. So half the times I don't even talk about what I do. I just show up and add value and people are interested. They want to hear more about that, right? So they kind of just find their way to it, which again, super thankful for that. But I can't even tell you how big of an impact it's had and my ability to speak clearly about what I do. Podcast guesting is just a great way to do that. And I've gotten to meet so many great people to collaborate with. I mean, I just can't even tell you the relationships I've built through podcasting on either side of the mic.
Do you feel like, because I am the same way with the relationships that have been built from me guesting and also having people on my show, people always ask like, well, how do you make that happen? And I can give them tips about, following up with the host. But do you think that's just something that's inherent to who you are, to who I am? Or do you think it's that you went into these opportunities with intention?
Yeah, I actually think it's, at first I was thinking the same thing you're sharing there, but I actually really believe it's something different now. And unless you've done tens of thousands of interviews, like you come from radio or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Unless you've been that person, this is a meaningful experience that we're having together. And if you really dive deep into how friendship works, friendship has a baseline of meaningful experience together. So that means something different for all people, right? Like maybe it's going on a whitewater rafting adventure together, but you never forget that. And you never forget who you were with, right? Yeah. And for so many people, this room that you and I are in right now, even though it's virtual, this is a meaningful experience we're getting to have together. So we have this baseline to be primed to actually be interested in doing more together because we won't forget this experience that we got to have.
I love that. I've never heard that before. And I think that sums it up. It's funny that you mentioned Crystal Profit because she was my first interview once COVID hit. She is a mother. I'm a mother. And we were both kind of like, what in the hell is going on? And we were laughing while we were interviewing. It was the first time we had ever met. But we were basically like, oh my gosh, this is my free time. Like my whole family is here. They're downstairs. And it was the first conversation with another adult kind of that either of us had had. And that was such a moment. We've both talked about it since then, but it was a meaningful experience. So I'm going to steal that. I'm going to give you credit for it.
You don't even need to give me credit. You can take it. That's your idea, Angie. I like it.
Yeah, that's such an impactful way to describe it. So I really appreciate that. 2 more questions. When was the last time that you pitched yourself for a visibility opportunity or a podcast interview?
Probably yesterday.
Okay. And do you use Podmatch to do it?
Yes, I actually use that exclusively now. So because I dislike social media so much, and sorry for anyone who loves it, it's just not my space. Yeah. Not my space like the old website, but my space. Anyway, so my wife is actually kind of my gatekeeper. So we have a social media person, but she handles my inbox. When people are asking me to be a guest or vice versa, right? That we have a response that we built out that says, hey, you've got to hit Alex up through Podmatch. Here's his profile. And from there, that's where I'll actually do my pitching or where I also receive them. So either way that goes, I try to keep it exclusively there because again, it's done so much of the groundwork for me. feel like it saves me 14 emails back and forth that I just don't want to send anyway.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I do it exclusively there. So I'm able to like do all my research and reach out and stuff like that. And for me, you and I have some similarities in this and stuff like that, but it doesn't take me 3 minutes to do a pitch. It takes me like 45 minutes because I'm going to listen to the show. I'm going to make sure I feel like this is going to be that meaningful experience that I want with somebody, right?
Yeah.
So I'm really tactful with that. But yesterday was, maybe it was the day, it was actually the day before, I'm sorry.
Okay.
The day, 2 days before our recording was last time I did this.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting that you said that about you spending 45 minutes. And I would love for listeners to hear me say this. Just because you are on a software that is helping you connect with podcast hosts does not mean that you can kind of phone in the pitch. And that was one of my biggest challenges when I have been on there. And even today, like I'm getting some emails, and you still have to personalize why you're reaching out to that host. Give them a topic that you think would be relevant for their audience. Podmatch is not an arranged marriage. It's not like,
Well
hey, both of you people, if you pair it on here, it's a done deal. Like you have to court the host if you are wanting to be a guest on their show. So I just want to make that perfectly clear. And I appreciate that you yourself are saying it takes me about 30 to 45 minutes to get a pitch out the door.
Angie, you've got to give me that soundbite of you saying that. That has got to go to everyone who's ever going to be a guest on our software. Because yes, I get the same thing. Sometimes it just says, hey, I'd like to be a guest on your show. I'm like,
literally.
So does everyone else. Not because my show is great, but everyone wants to be on a podcast. So why? And like, because I have this experience, go look at my profile. I'm like, you got to try harder. Like you got to try harder.
Yeah.
So I appreciate you saying that. I've got to get that soundbite.
Well, for sure. And I think that's the thing to know going into Podmatch, that you might get a bit of that if you're a host and a guest, but we had a membership for a year and a half. And when one of our members was getting started pitching herself, she just didn't want to go into Apple and have to do the legwork. And so she really went all in on Podmatch. I think she booked like 20 interviews on there.
Wow,
and it was
amazing.
Because she was pitching personally, pitching a specific topic, and it works. So if you get messages that are kind of, feel like, hey, I want to be a guest on your show, cool. Just carry on, stay focused on why you're there and that you're making real relationships and sending out real communications.
That's great. That's so good. Thank you.
Yeah. Anything specific when you get pitched? Because you still have podcasting made simple as a podcast, right?
Correct. Yeah.
And you guys release, it's a different format, isn't it? Because don't you do master classes that you then release as podcast episodes?
Correct. Our format is very unique. We do a quarterly virtual event. And the videos are pre-recorded from the speakers, but we stream them and then we do a live Q&A with the speaker and the audience that's there. And then we repurpose that from the speaker as an episode. I am not on but 3 episodes a quarter. So I do 2 interviews and 1 solo every quarter. And then the rest are outside experts like you, Angie. You've got to be on there at some point. I'm calling you out publicly. You guys can edit that out if you want.
Steve will be like, nope, I'm leaving it in.
Right? Yeah, I love that. Thanks, Steve. Anyway, yeah, like so an expert like you would come in and share your true craft. And the way we like to say it is it's kind of like we call it Pod Talks. It's like a TED Talk, but for the podcasting industry on either side of the mic, where someone who's a true expert who shares something that I could never share as well as them, come on and share that. And our episodes range from like 12 to 16 minutes usually. And even my intro is 14 seconds long. My outro is 9 seconds long. I mean, it is just straight to it, right? I did that intentionally, by the way. If you press the skip button one time, it skips forward 15 seconds. So it goes straight into, hey, Angie here. Here's what I'm talking about, right? So it just gets these podcasters straight to it. And I did that because, and I know this is slightly off topic, so sorry about that, but I did that because...
We're really okay with that.
The thing that I hear most from podcasters when I ask them what podcast they listen to, they say, oh, I don't really listen to podcasts. I hear it all the time. It's because they're busy making their own. I hear that from so many podcasters. So when I thought about what format they would like to digest, I was like, can I make it 12 to 14 minutes on the one topic that they really want, a deep dive? Then they'll listen. And sure enough, it ended up working. So that's kind of how that whole thing goes.
Yeah. Well, and also for hosts that are listening, so I've done some consulting with podcast hosts recently. And one of the first things I do when we're looking at their numbers, I like to go into Apple Connect and see like, when are people dipping off? And if they have a long intro, I feel like 5 years ago, that was a thing where you really had to introduce yourself and establish your credibility in that beginning section. No, people do not have the time for that. And so You can still establish credibility, but you could do it in a sentence. You could do it in 14 seconds
14
and
seconds.
we got to dial it back.
I love my intro and outro now. Like it's pretty new, so I still like listen to it. Sometimes I'm just like, how refreshing.
Oh, now I have to go listen to it. I record mine every time, but it's the same sentence. And then I do a fun fact now just for new people
cool.
to kind of get a sense of like who I am. They can love me or hate me very quickly. Alex, this was awesome. I really enjoyed getting to know you and having these conversations about podcasting and guesting in general. You're not on social. You are-ish. So if people want to connect with you.
I'm everywhere. Yes, I am. And you will get me if you reach out. I don't have like a team of a bunch of people. Alicia, my wife, will be the one who sees it first. But if you said you heard me through Angie, through Go Pitch Yourself, it will be me who responds to you.
Perfect. And then I would say the next best place for people to go is go sign up and check out Podmatch, correct?
Correct. Yeah. Everything I do, you'll find from there, but make sure you use joinpodmatch.com/Podwize. That's the link that you're going to want to use for the best deal you're ever going to get. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. And that's Podwize with a Z. And then we'll still link, and I'll talk about it in the outro, the other two softwares so that they can go to those pages if they're interested.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you for being here.
Yes, it was an honor to be here. Thanks so much, Angie. I appreciate you.
All right, friend, what's the word? What would you do? Would you pay to guest on someone's podcast? We've covered all the angles that you could possibly consider over the last 3 episodes. The ethics, the legality, logistics, potential ROI. So what do you say? Has this series impacted you and changed how you view interview opportunities? Talk to me. I'm over on LinkedIn at Angie Trueblood, and I would love to hear your thoughts. You can connect with me, send me a quick note that you were listening to this episode with Alex and wanted to share your thoughts. And I would love to chat with you in the DMs. And as I did mention in the episode, if you are looking to get your feet wet with podcast guesting, a great first step is to check out Podmatch. I have an affiliate link that gets you 10% off the current pricing. I negotiated that, taking my affiliate commission lower so that you could have a discount. So definitely give it a go if you're interested. You can go to joinpodmatch.com/Podwize, and that's Podwize with a Z. Okay. Be sure to tune back in 2 weeks for a solo episode of another new trend that I'm seeing: podcast hosts using guest interviews on their show as a way to connect and convert potential clients. I have some real thoughts on this, friends, and I'm going to share them with you. Okay. Until then, be well and be visible. So much for listening to this episode of Go Pitch Yourself. If you found this episode to be helpful, friend, you would be blown away by what we can accomplish together. Here are 2 next best steps. 1, be sure to sign up for our bi-weekly newsletter. That is twice a month, if that term confuses you as much as it does me. Each week that our episodes drop, I send an action-focused email, including an insider tip of the week based on the work that we do behind the scenes in our clients' business. For example, a recent tip of the week included how to estimate how large a podcast audience is. To get access to this exclusive content, pop on over to the podwisegroup.com/pitches and sign up. As a special thank you, you'll get your first insider tip of the week as access to 6 pitches my team and I have sent that were accepted, including the core components of any great pitch. Number 2, schedule a call with me to figure out which of our services, if any, would be a good fit for you. We have a variety of ways to support you and your team in helping grow your business through podcast guesting, and I am pretty skilled at helping identify pain points and solutions. Hop over to the podwisegroup.com/services and grab a spot on my calendar at the bottom of the page.